Attention to orders. This week's killed in action: Chief Warrant Officer Dustin Morriston and Warrant Officer Lucas Lowe. Both were killed during a routine training mission off the coast of Texas, which just goes to show during training, peacetime or wartime, our men and women are always in harm's way. Local veterans who have served and passed: Bruce E. Keene, U.S. Navy. Ansel Ick Ballinger. Other veterans around the state and nation: Robert Bob Hyatt, U.S. Army, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Claude Serra, U.S. Army Air Corps, World War II. William Hines, U.S. Navy, Vietnam. Ray Clickmore, U.S. Navy, World War II. Robert Poole, U.S. Army Air Corps, World War II. Earl Bainsbeck, U.S. Army. Andrew Butler, U.S. Army. Charles Cleveland, U.S. Army, World War II. Donald Cassidy, U.S. Army. Edward Dahm, U.S. Navy Reserve. William Rump, U.S. Army. Edward Martin, U.S. Army. Harry Esterline, U.S. Air Force. William Nobis, U.S. Army, Korea. Donald Noshwander, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Wesley Gold, U.S. Army. James Gerber, U.S. Army. Terry Tandy, U.S. Army. Paul Moore, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam. Robert Seabuck, U.S. Navy, World War II. Peter Onan, U.S. Army. Lester Watkins Jr., U.S. Army. Winfred Rocky Shannon, U.S. Army, Iraq. William Durhard, U.S. Army, World War II. Maynard Spitz, U.S. Army, World War II. Donald Farr, U.S. Air Force. James Brenna, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Donald Gill, U.S. Army, Korea. David Jones, U.S. Marines, Korea. John Guthrie, U.S. Navy, Iraq. Frederick Bingaman, U.S. Army, Korea. Bruce Schneider, U.S. Navy, Korea. James Vaughn, U.S. Army, World War II. Harold Oney, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Robert Glasscosh, U.S. Navy, World Vietnam. James Milka, U.S. Army. Timothy Kernan, U.S. Navy, Vietnam. Daniel Pennell, U.S. Army, World War II. Eldon Boydston, U.S. Navy, World War II. Robert Milligan, U.S. Army, Vietnam. Michael Julerin, U.S. Navy. William Johnson Sr., U.S. Army, World War II. Gilbert Blasco, U.S. Army. Joseph Brown, U.S. Navy, World War II. James Baer, U.S. Marines. Carol Ryder, U.S. Army, Iraq. Donald Masseron, U.S. Army. George Leto, U.S. Air Force, Vietnam. Dorothy Brownfield, U.S. Navy Waves, World War II. Francis Spaulding, U.S. Army, World War II. Murray Gilman, U.S. Army, Korea. John Campbell, U.S. Army. John DePrazzo, U.S. Army, World War II. Paul Smolin, U.S. Marines, Korea. Police and fire around the nation. Officer Sandy De La Cruz, Freeport Police Department, New York. Lieutenant Courtney Carroll Provost, LaFroche Parish, Louisiana. Officer Michael Anderson, Lockerbie Police Department, Colorado. Inspector Benita Blanton, Kentucky Vehicle Enforcement Police. And Officer Ricardo Fernandez, Union City Police Department, New Jersey. Rosie the Riveters, Bernice Adams, Joanna All, Dorothy Dixon, Leona Ferris, Ruth Fletcher, Trinidad Flores, Mary Kerr, Vera King, Henrietta Love, Margaret Morrison, Jean Murphy, Mona Nord, Elsie Anna, Fern Panazzo, Stella Prononsky, Lillian Peterson, Jean Skillman, Grace Steed, and POW recently recovered Army Corporal Joseph Pellenter, missing from the Korean War, declared missing January 13, 1951, and identified December 22nd of this year. And Navy electricians made third class Cecil Bernacord, missing World War II, killed in action aboard the USS Oklahoma, and discovered December 18th of this year.
Thank you.
Sergeant Paul Soldier, Captain and Court,
Turn to your post.